Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman, and we're here with another video to help you improve your chess game. We haven't done an amateur game in a while, and I found a really instructive one that I'm sure you will like. A while ago, I did a video called the Immortal Quiescence Error Game, where the amateur player made a lot of quiescence errors in the game. And I thought this game might deserve a title too. This is sort of the Immortal, it's not a fair trade game. Let's talk a little bit about fair trades. Normally a fair trade would be where you trade a piece for a same piece of the same value. So a queen for a queen, a rook for a rook, a bishop for a bishop, a knight for a knight, a pawn for a pawn. And since bishops and knights have roughly the same average value, trading a bishop for a knight is sometimes considered a fair trade. The biggest exception to that would be if early in the game one side trades a bishop for a knight and gives the other side the advantage of the bishop pair, which is worth on the average of about a half a pawn. That's usually not a fair trade unless you get something special in return, like an exposed king or a wrecked pawn structure or something. So fair trades are usually things that people don't think a lot about, but a grandmaster once made a comment. I think he was writing an article for one of the magazines, and he said, "There's no such thing as a fair trade." And he said it a little bit tongue-in-cheek, because obviously there are some positions where there's completely fair trades. You could be in an equal endgame and trade off and still be in an equal endgame. But what he meant was, a lot of times, maybe even most of the time, when you make these, quote, fair trades, it usually benefits one side a little bit more than the other side, or maybe even a lot more. And in this game, we're going to see some fair trades which look, by Reinfeld values, 3 for 3, 5 for 5, 9 for 9, look equal, but actually they're not. And when you have these trades, you want to be very careful about them. Let me read you something from the book Chess Rules of Thumb by Lev Albert and Al Lawrence. Grandmaster Albert and Lawrence say, recognize 5 characteristics of a critical position. And number 2 in their list is when any pieces are exchanged, especially queens. So they're telling you that when you make these trades, even if they look like they're fair trades, it could be a critical decision, and you have to make it very carefully. All right, let's take a look at today's game, which I think is very interesting. All right, we're going to look at it from black's point of view. White played d4, black played knight f6. White plays c4, black plays e6. White plays knight c3, black plays Nimzo-Indian, bishop b4. And white plays bishop to g5. That's the Leningrad variation. World champion Boris Spassky liked to play that. He was from that area, in fact. And now the number 1 move for black is to play h6. And here's the principle I tell people. Let's get the lines off the board. The principle I tell people is, when somebody pins a knight like this, ask yourself the following questions. If bishop takes f6 is a threat, then you need to deal with the threat, or that threat and other threats. If bishop takes f6 is neutral, then you sort of ignore it and, see what happens. If bishop takes f6 is bad, then you want to play h6 for sure, because you want to get rid of what I call the two-way bishop. This bishop on g5 is a two-way bishop. In this diagonal from h4 to d8, it's pinning the knight, and it's very strong. On the other diagonal, it can come back to the center, it could get rid of the pin, it could play onto this nice diagonal from h2 to b8. So it's a two-way bishop, and when you have a two-way bishop, you want to make it a one-way bishop. So you play h6 with the idea of asking the question to the bishop, putting the question to the bishop. And now you say to the bishop, what are you going to do? Are you going to give me the bishop pair by playing bishop takes f6? I'd be very happy with that. Are you going to play bishop h4? Well, in that case, you still have a pin, but you can't come back to the center very easily. Or are you going to give up on the pin and play bishop f4, in which case you no longer have the pressure on the knight through to the queen? So h6, putting the question to the bishop, is pretty automatic. For this video, I made the window a little bit wider so you can see the top moves, and you can see the top moves in the database and in the engine. And you can see in the database, the master database here on Lichess, h6 is the most popular move, followed closely by c5, and the engine says c5 is maybe microscopically better, and h6. So black plays a good move here. He plays c5, but I would have probably played h6 right away and said, where are you going, Mr. Bishop? All right, so c5, good move. And white plays a3. And black says, I can double the pawns now. So you are giving up the bishop pair. As we said, fair trades. Is this a fair trade? Well, it's pretty fair. White gets the bishop pair, the advantage of the bishop pair. He has two bishops and black doesn't. But black gets those doubled pawns on the queen side. And as if you're an experienced player in the Nimzo-Indian, you know those doubled pawns on the queen side can be a disadvantage for white. So it's sort of a trade-off here. And now the famous thing for black here is to never play d5. You're going to do sort of everything but play d5. There's lots and lots of variations in the Nimzo-Indian. You can look them up, like the Hübner variation, where once white has those doubled c-pawns, black never wants to play d5. He wants to go after those pawns with moves like knight c6 and later maybe knight a5 and playing maybe b6 and bishop a6. So it would look something like this. Let's just make some moves here to show you. Let's say black plays d6, white plays e3, knight c6, bishop d3. Let's say h6, bishop h4. Could play b6, knight f3, castle, castle. And now black can play something like knight a5, or he could play bishop a3. The problem with playing bishop a6 first is queen a4, but actually that's not as big a problem, because on bishop a6, queen a4 hitting the knight and the bishop, black can play knight a5 and save both pieces, and then now the white queen and the white bishop are kind of stuck guarding that double pawn, and black can add more pressure. He can play rook c8 and threaten to take the pawn on d4. If white ever plays d5, black can just play e5 and go past him. If you get a pawn structure like this, the bishop on d3 is bad. These pawns are fixed and targets, as you can see. Black can later play a move like g5 to get out of the pin, and then maybe play knight h5 and so on. So this is a typical Nimzo-Indian thing that you learn. As I said, you can always look up the Hübner variation, which is similar, except in the Hübner variation, the bishop isn't on g5. So back to the game. In the game, black plays h6. That's a good move. And here, white plays bishop to h4. And you can see there's now no game found in the database. And here, black makes a positional mistake. Black plays d5. Black said after the game he was a little worried about white playing d5, but actually you want white to play d5 because it really fixes the pawns in a weak way. So d6, and if d5, just play like e5, and this pawn structure is better for black. Okay, so black plays the mistake d5. If you're going to play the Nimzo-Indian, and my student and I did talk about this, and you're going to play bishop takes c3 and double those pawns, you almost never want to play d5. It never is too much in chess, because there could be tactics where d5 might be a move, but positionally it's very undesirable to let him undouble his pawns. And if we look at the evaluation of the position, before black played d5, you can see in the upper right there, the number one move for black is queen a5, and black is up by 0.8. By the way, here, as a point, you're not really worried about him doubling this pawn and giving away the bishop pair. Of course, he can't play bishop takes knight now because the queen takes c3 check. But even if white stops that and plays a move like, I don't know, queen to d2, you're still really not worried about here. Now, of course, the computer says you can start winning material already. But bishop takes f6 is not really a big positional threat. So queen a5, as the engine says, is the best move by far and gives black an advantage of about 0.8. Okay, so black plays d5, and now you can see his advantage has gone all the way down to 0 from 0.8 by allowing white to undouble his pawns. So white plays queen a4 check, not the best move, allowing bishop d7 attacking the queen and not giving him time to take the pawn. Bishop d7, queen b3, and now queen takes b7 is not really much of a threat. For instance, if black takes the pawn and white takes queen takes b7, black can still play queen a5, and now the rook is poisoned because on queen takes a8, queen takes c3 check, will win the rook with check. And this really can't be allowed. And even if white stops that and plays a move like, I don't know, rook to c1, if he plays rook c1, we can play queen takes a3. If he plays, notice the bishop can't go back to d2. That was another benefit of playing h6, is to get the bishop to stop the possibility of guarding those dark squares. If king to d2, then black could even take this pawn, or if he really is worried about the rook, he can play bishop c6, and then after queen checks, he can move the king up. But it's probably better here just to take the pawn and rethreaten queen takes c3 check. All right, back to the game. So black is playing very conservatively here, and he's afraid of queen takes b7, so he plays b6, but he had a lot more aggressive ways to play this. So white finally undoubles the pawns, but now not only is white undoubling the pawns, he's actually winning a pawn by removal of the guard. So b6 is actually a tactical mistake because white is attacking this pawn twice and it's guarded twice, but one of the two pieces guarding it can be captured. So whenever you have a situation where the counting tells you there's two attackers and two defenders, if one of the defenders is not really capable of staying on the board or is somehow pinned to a king or something, you can't really count that defender. So after pawn takes, here black could have played g5 first and then recaptured to keep the knight in, but black automatically recaptured, which allows bishop takes f6, removing the guard, queen takes f6, queen takes d5, winning a pawn. Now you might say, well, white's up a pawn, he should be winning, but if you look at the evaluation again up here in the upper right corner, black's actually slightly better. Why? Because black can castle on the next move after he saves the rook with bishop c6, hitting the queen, and white's way behind in development, and white's center is a little bit loose, and it's going to be tough for white to get his king into a safe place pretty quickly. So bishop c6, black plays queen to c4, hitting the c-pawn twice. White could just ignore that and castle. White, if black ignores it and castles, and white tries to win the c5 pawn, he's going to lose even more time, but that's not the kind of thing that lower rated players usually calculate. So he just guards the pawn, which is very reasonable. And white plays rook to c1. And now black decides he has a double attack, but the computer says that the double attack with queen g5 is not the best move. Black said, oh, I'm attacking the g2 pawn twice, and I'm attacking the rook, and I might win a pawn. But actually, sometimes when you see these sequences, A, B, C, queen g5, and then he saves the rook, and then bishop g2, you should look at CBA instead of A, B, C. So here, actually, bishop takes first is right. Now that looks wrong because he's going to hit the rook. But the problem is when he hits the rook and you play queen g5, he can't take the rook because queen takes c1 is checkmate. Which means when he saves the rook and you play queen takes g2, the other rook is going to be a goner. So it turns out bishop takes g2 is a really cute tactical trick, which is just winning. I didn't see that right away. You know, the computer, of course, jumps on it right away and points it out to us. But bishop takes g2 is the right move here. Let's get the whoops, didn't want to play bishop there. Just wanted to click on something to get the lines off the board. There we go. Okay, lines are off the board, so black plays queen g5. He says, I don't need to castle, I have a tactic, a double attack. And now white plays a really bad move. He just throws a pawn, and he's so afraid of the double attack between g2 and c1 that he just throws a pawn in the way. But he really didn't need to do that. He could just play rook to d1. And if bishop takes g2, let's look at that line. He could just play rook to d1, and if bishop takes g2, then he could attack the queen with a knight. Well, no matter how black plays this, it's going to come out fairly equal. So this was the better line for white. Let's go back. So white plays f4. He just throws a pawn in the way, hoping that will do the trick. And of course, black gobbles up that pawn and still hits the rook. And now the king is becoming more exposed. It's going to be very difficult to castle. So white saves the rook with rook a1. And if you look at the evaluation now, if black plays the sneaky pin, knight to e5. Why is it a sneaky pin? Because the pawn is pinned to the queen, and we're not trying to win the pinned pawn. We're trying to take advantage of the fact that it's not really guarding e5. After knight e5 and the queen moves, black has a very, very strong attack, or he could just castle first, which is very good. Can't complain, and he does castle. And now black can get his rooks into the attack, and white can't. So white plays knight f3. And again, let's take the lines off the board. Okay, so if you were black here, what would you do? Well, you could pause the video and figure out. But the answer is very easy. Up to now, we've been trying to move every piece once before we move any piece twice unless there's a tactic, and we've had some tactics and some safety issues where we had to move a piece twice. But now there isn't. And here, if black gets his rooks into the game, this game is toast. So let's look at the most common move here. Put the rook on the same line with the king. Just play rook on f to e8. It's such a simple move, and it's very, very powerful. Anytime you have all these pieces into the attack and your opponent can't get his pieces out, the game's pretty much over. And what black should look at this position and say, I need my rooks. If I have my rooks and he doesn't have his rooks, and I've got all my pieces out and his king's stuck in the middle. So now the e-pawn is pinned. So black is threatening bishop takes f3, g takes f3, queen takes f3, winning a pawn, but he doesn't even have to do that. He could do other things. He could just double his rooks. And notice in this position, it's pretty much impossible for white to develop the bishop. If he moves the g-pawn, black will just take queen takes f3 with another sneaky pin. If he moves the e-pawn, black can take that with the queen or the rook. He's got so many winning moves here. The computer says maybe bishop takes f3 first and then take the pawn. But obviously that's no good. You can't play e4 for the same reason. You just can't get the bishop out, and black's just going to double his rooks on the e-file and crush white with all these threats. So rook f e8 is a very easy move to create a fantastically winning position. And you can see in the evaluation bar, if he puts either rook on e8, it's better to put the f rook from my point of view so it doesn't block the other rook. The computer says the a rook is even microscopically better, blocking the f rook on f8. I probably wouldn't do that, but of course the engine's rated 3600. He can do anything he wants. But you can see the evaluation is minus 6.3. Well, anything over minus 1 is pretty much winning for black. But if you're up to minus 6.3, that's up to easily winning for black. So all black has to do is get his rooks in the game. But now black has a better idea. For some reason, he's afraid that knight's going to guard the d-pawn or something. And he makes a horrible fair trade. Remember, we said this is the unfair trade game, the great unfair trade game. And he takes this beautiful bishop, which is controlling this diagonal and creating all kinds of sneaky pins and stopping white from easily castling. And he trades it off for that terrible knight. Bishop takes f3. Watch what happens to the evaluation up here in the upper right when black plays that move. Right now he's up 6.3, and he takes the knight, and he goes from 6.3 down to about 3.0, 2.9. And now white should take back with the e-pawn. E takes f3, and try to hold on for dear life. Instead, black makes a mistake, and he takes this way with the g-pawn, but now he's still going to have trouble castling if black plays it right. And the best move here is to play knight e5 with the sneaky pin again, hitting the queen. And the queen, notice, can't go back to d3 because the knight would be guarding that square too. The second best move is to check him so he can't castle, but then he could sort of run toward the queen side. And the third best move is our favorite rook f e8, and again, white can't move his e-pawn up. Queen takes f3 as a threat. If white plays bishop g2, here we go again, knight here, and the queen can't go there. And what happens if the queen goes back? Well, here we go again. We could play knight takes f3 check and win the pawn because we've got the sneaky pin there. Or black can play queen check, and if the king tries to run toward the queen side, we can win this pawn with check. Pawn takes pawn, queen takes d4 check, and blah. Anyway, back to the game. So white should take with the e-pawn. He takes with the g-pawn, and now black wants to get his pieces in the game. Black plays the good move, rook fe8. White sees the sneaky pin, queen takes f3, gets the king out of the way, but now the king's stuck in the middle for the rest of the game because obviously once he moves the king, he can't castle. And now the question is, where do you put the other rook? Well, one of the things you could do here is play like rook to e3 and double your rooks on the e file, or you could play the sneaky pin knight e5. Once you miss an idea like that sneaky pin knight e5, it's not surprising that you might continue to miss it. Well, he does bring his rook into the game and put the rook on the same line with the king. Can't be bad, and if you look at the evaluation now, Black's still winning easily. He's back up to 5.8. White plays king c2 to get out of that. And now the best move again is the sneaky pin with knight e5. There's one move higher rated than that, as you can see up here on the evaluation. It's to remove the guard on this pawn. You play b5. And you might say, well, that's not safe. He could just take it. But if he takes it, the queen's no longer guarding the d-pawn. And you can take the d-pawn and open up this king. And all these black pieces are ready to attack the king. And White's position's falling apart, minus 5.8. So the cute move b5, removing the guard on the pawn. And notice if he plays queen to d3, we now still have the sneaky pin, but we can also play a move like rook to e3. And just things are very, very bad here for White. This is, again, about minus 6 in the evaluation. So in the game, Black takes the pawn first, and now White cannot play c takes d4 because of rook c8 pinning the queen to the king, so he has to take with the queen. All right, so in this position, should Black trade queens or not? Okay, well, remember what Lev Albert said, trading queens is always a critical decision. Well, here's a question. First question is, White's king is in the middle of the board. Would you rather have White's king in the middle of the board in the endgame? Or would you rather have White's king in the middle of the board in the middle game? Well, a king in the board in the middle of the board in the middle game with the queens on the board is usually disastrous. A king in the middle of the board in the end game is usually great. So if you trade queens here, the white king becomes a million times safer and a million times more powerful. So if we look at the engine's top moves here, if you look on the upper right, queen f3 check, queen c7, queen b8, all the moves that Black can play with the queen that would not trade queens and would be a safe queen move, they're all the top moves. Just keep the queen on the board, and eventually that white king is going to be in big trouble. Here, Black plays what may be Black's worst move of the game. Black said, well, you know, I can open up that c file, I can get rid of his centralized queen, that's his only developed piece. So Black trades queens. Well, not only does that make the white king much safer and much stronger in the endgame, but it also gets rid of White's isolated c-pawn and makes it a very, very powerful passed d-pawn. Right now, this pawn is very weak. It's not a passed pawn. It's isolated. There's no adjacent file pawns. And it's you know, it can be attacked if Black plays a move like queen c7 and keeps the pressure on, and then gets ready to move the knight up or attack the c-file. Black's just winning this game. It's minus 3.7, which is not as good as he had before. The engine says the best move is queen f5 check. But watch what happens to the evaluation when he trades queens. This is a very, very, very unfair trade of queen for queen. And when he did it, when I went over the game with my student, I'm like, really? Really? You would trade queens here? I'm like, oh my goodness. He never thought the fact that the exposed king is so much weaker with the queens on the board, and the fact that he made his pawn structure so much better. Watch the evaluation. Right now it's minus 5.0. Boom. Goes to minus 1.1. Black's still ahead in development, but all his other advantages have disappeared, and all of a sudden it's a game again. So of course White recaptures, and now you want to make sure this e-pawn can't come down the board and help the d-pawn. So you want to play either f5 or rook e3. Black plays rook e3, good move. White attacks it, and now, of course, we don't want these pawns to connect with each other, so we want to keep the rook here. So we want to play rook on d to e8 and keep that bishop at bay and keep those pawns on white squares and keep the deep pawn there. Otherwise, it wouldn't make any sense to play rook e3 if you're going to move the rook on e3 now. Unfortunately, now Black makes another bad move. He brings the rook back. Well, if he's going to bring the rook back, why did he put it on e3, which was a good move to begin with? And now white gets to play e4 and connect his pawns, which he doesn't do. He plays bishop there first, which is a mistake because now black can take advantage of the sneaky pin and go after these pawns again. And all of a sudden, black's advantage is very big. So the right move here was to reconnect those pawns. And now if the knight goes up and does the sneaky pin, the king can be a monster here guarding these wonderful center pawns, and that d pawn is a protected passed pawn, and all of a sudden white is better. So bishop h3 was a mistake. Should have played e4. Now black needs to play a sneaky pin move, knight c5 or knight e5. Of course, black's been missing that, so he plays the innocuous knight f6, and now he's attacking the d4 pawn, but white can save it with e3. And white has a nice solid center again. Not quite as good as in the other line, but if both sides play perfectly, the engine says this should end up a draw. But now, even though black has the queenside majority, 2-on-1 on the AB file against the A pawn, but white already has the connected passed pawn in the center. He has the D pawn, and the E pawn is strong too. So black plays knight d5 and hits the E pawn. White says, oh, finally, you let me develop my bishop, you let me develop my rooks, I'm back in the game, look at this. Black was way ahead in development, he had all his pieces out, and white couldn't get his pieces out, and now white has his pieces out. Black goes after that pawn again. White says, oh, I can save it, I'll just push it and hit your knight. Black hits the bishop. Bishop rewires to the F1 to A6 diagonal. Black guards his knight with the pawn. It's still 0-0. Black hits the rook goes to the open file. White puts the rook on the open file. All right, right now the C file is neutral. What's the rule with neutral files? Well, you want to keep them neutral or try to gain control of them. What you don't want to do is give away control. So what black should do here is either play rook on e to c7 to double his rooks on the open file and keep it neutral, or he should counterattack the d pawn and not give white time to recover. Instead, black makes another unfair equal trade. We've got these equal trades, except if black takes the rook and white takes back, black loses control of the c file and has no threats, and white's controlling the c file. So again, watch what happens to the evaluation when you trade rooks. This is why I call this the Immortal unfair trade game, because every time black's trading something of equal value, it's not equal. So right now, black is only down by 0.2. Watch what happens when he takes the rook and white gets the file. It goes from 0.2 up here on the right, if you're looking at the evaluation. It goes from 0.2 to 1.3. So now 1.5, 1.4 as the engine looks deeper. So now all of a sudden white's winning. He's got the better king in the middle. He's got the better pawn structure. He's got the better rook. His bishop can go all over the board. It's faster than the knight. So this is now a winning position for white. We're not going to spend a lot of time on the rest of the game because things deteriorated. Now black makes another bad move. He weakens his pawn in front of his king. Black pins that pawn. Black tries to save it. White pinned the pawn. Black tries to save it. White plays there. That's a little bit of a strange move. He could have gotten more pressure on the g4 square. Plays bishop c6. Now black should attack the bishop with the rook and then try to get out of the pin. He tries to break the pin, but now there's two pieces attacking the g4 pawn and only one guarding it, and the bishop on c6 is guarding e4, so the f3 pawn doesn't have to guard e4. So now white wins another pawn and the game's pretty much over. Pawn takes, rook takes. Now white is up material for the first time. Black gets out of the pin. White says, ooh, I can score a touchdown with that h-pawn. He can run right in toward the corner. Black counterattacks the bishop. Bishop saves. King goes in the middle, but actually the king might want to stay on the king's side and try to fight against that h-pawn, which just comes down the board some more. Knight comes back. Here comes that pawn. Black says, maybe I do need to bring the king over. White says, let's trade rooks first. Trades the rooks. This should be an easy win. White says, I can play bishop d3, threatening e5, guarding the h7 square. Now, white can just bring the king up. He does, good move. Black plays a5. White says, oh, good, I'll play a4 and fix your 2 pawns so your 2-on-1 majority can't create a passed pawn. Now black's completely helpless. Tries to bring the king over. The bishop blocks him in. King just waits. The bishop guards the h7 square to win the knight. Black can resign. Now it's +7. He wins the knight. He tries to break to get a passed a pawn. White says, I can always sack the bishop for that pawn while I'm getting a queen. Brings the king up to win the f6 pawn. Black says, I can't keep pushing my a pawn. Maybe I should resign. Bishop checks, king back, takes the pawn. And now the engine says mate in 12. All right, so this was a very instructive game. Hopefully you enjoyed the game. You can click the button for thumbs up, for liking the video. You can subscribe, but the best thing you can do, tell your friends about the channel Dan Heisman Chess. Why haven't I been making a lot of videos lately? Well, it's because Dan Lone is creating a new chess improver group. It's actually called the, and make sure I get the right name here, Chess Improver Club. And he wanted me to make 3 introductory videos for him, overviewing how adults get better at chess, especially intermediate adults. So instead of making videos for my YouTube channel, I made 3 videos for his Chess Improvers Club. Okay, so we'll be hearing more about that in the future. All right, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye.